Expertgruppen för biståndsanalys, EBA, är en statlig kommitté som oberoende analyserar och utvärderar svenskt internationellt bistånd för att det ska kunna förbättras och utvecklas. EBA har 10 ledamöter med kompetenser från olika biståndsområden och ett kansli som verkställer besluten. Förutom våra rapporter så ordnar vi seminarier, workshops och möten mellan olika parter. Varje år sammanfattar EBA sin verksamhet i årsberättelsen Biståndsanalys. Den kan beställas från kansliet eller laddas ner på eba.se. EBA har ett oberoende i relation till uppdragsgivaren regeringen, liksom i relation till vad som utvärderas, samt till de rapportförfattare som anlitas. Rapportförfattarna ansvarar själva för slutsatser och rekommendationer i sina studier. Allt vi producerar som rapporter, seminarier och vår podcast EBA-podden finns tillgängligt på vår hemsida.
And that will be about all of the Swedish that we will speak here today. And with that, we're switching to English. Welcome, everyone. I am thrilled to see that we are so many here today to discuss the topics of today that are peace and conflict under the seminar titled Conflict, Democracy and Peace, Exploring What Works. My name is Katarina Tracz, and I am a member of the expert group for aid studies. But today I am first and foremost here as your moderator. As you heard in this trailer in the beginning, EBA or EBA is a government committee that analyzes and evaluates Swedish development cooperation. And the goal is to help it to become more efficient and more effective. And in order to do so, we work with researchers, various types of experts to bring forward knowledge and highlight important issues in international development. And the aim of this work is indeed to build bridges between different parts of society that are involved in this, such as policymakers, researchers, and practitioners. Today's focus, like I mentioned, it is peace and conflict, and we will hear 4 researchers present their studies here in person, 3 of them, and 1 joining us online from Zurich. We are also very happy to have Janni Lilja from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs with us here today, and Christopher Burnett-Cargill from SIDA, who will give their input on the presentations and the studies that we will take part of today. Don't worry, we will have a coffee break approximately at 2:20. And towards the end of today's seminar, we'll also have time for you, the audience, to pose questions. I would like to remind you that this seminar is being recorded, and we also have photos taken here today. So if you don't want to be seen in the recording, I recommend you to sort of stand way down there in the back. And if you don't want to be in the photos, please feel free to talk to Matilda, who is walking around here somewhere. There is Matilda, who will take the pictures, and she'll make sure that you're not in them. So with that, I will give the floor to our first report author here today. It's Kate Lonergan, who's author and postdoctoral researcher at the Uppsala Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And you are here to present the report, the EBA-report, What Are They Fighting For? An issue-based approach to the analysis and resolution of civil war. And with that, please, Kate.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction. It's great to be here and see such a full room of people who are interested in peace and democracy and our research findings here. So I'm here today on behalf of my report co-authors and colleagues, Johan Brashear and Sebastian Ratema, also at the Uppsala University Department of Peace and Conflict Research, to present our findings that try to dig in a little bit into this question of what are they fighting for. And this focuses really on the issues that come at the heart of conflict and civil war. And every conflict really boils down to what the parties are fighting for. This revolves around sort of the specific demands and issues or desires that warring parties are willing to take up arms over. But this is something that we argue needs to be better understood in order to understand how to analyze and resolve conflicts more effectively. And so this report places issues at the center of our understanding and tries to bring a clearer understanding of what fuels civil war and how we can achieve lasting peace to resolve civil war. And there are sort of three main messages from this report. The first is quite simple, that conflict issues matter. That these issues, or the demands that rebel groups raise publicly, the sort of things that fuel people to take up arms and to continue fighting, matter for understanding how to resolve a conflict. And second, that addressing these issues can help us to reach longer lasting and more sustainable peace. So when we think about negotiating an end to an armed conflict, to constructing a peace agreement, it matters not just what provisions go into the peace agreement and how this agreement is structured, but also how well the content of the peace agreement speaks to the core issues that are at the heart of what armed groups are demanding and fighting for. And lastly, that this interplay between understanding the issues and crafting more effective solutions is really what is critical for sustainable peace. And this is how we can, one of the pieces to the puzzle to crafting more sustainable resolutions and negotiated agreements. And the questions we ask in this report come out of a sort of a classic understanding of civil war, developed, we call this the conflict triangle, developed by Peter Wallenstein, that argues that conflict brings together a combination of behavior, actors, and issues. And previously in conflict research, we've understood a lot about the behavior and the actors. So this is who fights, the actors, and how they fight, the behaviors. But what we understand quite a lot less about is the issues, or what groups are fighting for. So in this report, we're trying to bring some focus and shed some light on this component of the conflict triangle, which we've long understood matters, but we haven't understood as much about exactly how it matters and how to bring that into the conflict resolution process. So this leads to two main questions at the center of this report. First, what issues do conflict parties fight over? And then secondly, how do these conflict issues affect negotiations and peace agreements, and in what way does this matter for building more sustainable peace negotiations? And in order to answer these questions, we highlight two new data sets. The first is the Uppsala Conflict Issues dataset. This is a global dataset covering 1989 through 2017, that a massive undertaking to essentially code all of the demands that rebel groups have raised over this time period. This comes out to over 14,000 stated conflict issues across 329 different rebel groups. And this is publicly available on the Uppsala Conflict Data Program website. But this data set essentially gives us some insight into the demands that rebel groups raise on a yearly basis, the nature of those issues that have been raised, and thinking about how to sort of classify and organize these issues. And then we also, building on the conflict issues data, build a data set that we've developed for this report in particular, that looks at how issues track onto peace agreements. So when a peace agreement is signed, which of these issues that have been raised in this conflict actually get regulated in the subsequent peace agreement. And this covers over, let's see, 253 peace agreements, have to be exact about that, and spanning over 3,500 pages of peace agreement text that we analyzed to see these trends. So related to this first question, what issues do parties fight over? We see kind of three main areas of issues that are raised and sort of come into focus. So a first set of issues is around the conflict goals, or how a group would like to see a political or societal system functioning after conflict. These are things around varying degrees of autonomy or independence, perhaps things related to demands for rights, civil rights, cultural rights, religious and political rights. Other elements of sort of how politics are organized, reforming parliament, reforming the judicial system, holding or opposing elections, a theme we'll hear more about in the second half of this day, I think, and also demands for various things like land reforms is often very central. Another set of conflict issues focus around what we call the dynamics of conflict. So how a conflict plays out, how the various parties should behave or conduct themselves within the conflict. So things like ending foreign involvement in civil wars, returning refugees and IDPs, ensuring safe and fair return, or issues like prisoner return and exchange during the conflict. And then finally, a set of issues around conflict resolution. So various demands for how conflicts should be resolved and ended, ceasefires and negotiations, transitional justice processes to focus on reconstruction and accountability afterwards, and things like that. So from these conflict issues, we see that these demands span sort of the whole range of conflict dynamics. And we see kind of three main ways that the issues data and really understanding a more nuanced understanding of what conflict parties are demanding and fighting for can be useful for policymakers. So the first is thinking around the process of supporting negotiations, that a more detailed and nuanced understanding of what the issues are, what the demands are of the parties involved in a negotiation can help to tailor or direct the negotiation support process in a way that speaks to these issues, so that highlights an understanding of what the groups are fighting for. And very closely related is the ability to think, to make connections across cases and to think about issues as a thematic analysis. So if you are working in a context where a particular issue is key for the conflict parties, to think also about how similar issues have been handled in other contexts, in other periods of time, perhaps, if this is an ongoing conflict where this issue has come up, if it's been a consistent one, or rather something that comes and goes. And then lastly, informing peace building and development projects, to think about what are some other ways to get at the issues that drive the warring parties, to bring these demands to the fore through development and peace building interventions as well. So essentially, a more nuanced and detailed understanding of what the parties are fighting for can help us to design how we address and operate within conflict contexts. The second half of the report looks essentially at how conflict issues matter for lasting peace. And do peace agreements first, do they actually address the issues that parties are fighting for? And to what extent do they do this? And this is an important question, because we often think about designing a peace agreement through the different provisions or regulations that go into it, and how those regulations relate to lasting peace afterwards. But without kind of making that first connection to whether these provisions actually address demands that are raised and how well they address the demands that are raised. And keeping in mind that sometimes things can get left on the table or never in fact make it to the table, make it into the discussions that may still be central issues and demands that are at the heart of what the conflict parties are fighting for. So to see that full spectrum of demands and what can actually make it into the agreement. But in this report, looking at sort of the averages across a global data set of peace agreements, we see that on average, about 43% of the conflict issues raised are actually regulated in some way through a peace agreement provision. I think the caveat and space for future research here is does not say something about how these provisions are implemented, but whether they are sort of addressed in the negotiations and make it into the agreement. And essentially, we see that regulating more issues, addressing more issues in a peace agreement increases the probability of lasting peace. On average, agreements that address more conflict issues last for a longer time, are more sustainable, and create more lasting peace. And looking more closely at the data, we can also see that there are some examples of issues that are more commonly addressed than others. One key sort of theme within the issues that are addressed in peace agreements includes various demands for rights, for civil, religious, or gender rights. For example, the peace agreement in Sudan included, the comprehensive peace agreement in Sudan includes a provision declaring equal rights for men and women, highlighting that as a key issue that was both demanded by the conflict parties, but also something that featured within the high-level negotiation discussions. Other things like refugee return, laying out the parameters for returning displaced persons and refugees to their home areas, as well as issues around security sector reform and disarmament and reintegration. So how to sort of organize these processes of bringing former fighters back into society. So these are just a few examples of some of the ways issues are regulated in peace agreements. So you may be wondering sort of how does this happen in practice? We also focus on two examples of peace negotiations as sort of both a cautionary tale in Darfur and then a perhaps instructive tale in Colombia of how negotiations fall short and succeed in addressing issues. So the first case study focuses on the Darfur Peace Agreement, which was signed in May 2006, which was a very short-lived agreement that was rejected within mere days by the key stakeholders, both the signatories to the party and the population that was intended to sort of that was affected by conflict and saw sort of strong opposition from the population, essentially saying that this agreement does not address any of the core issues that we are fighting about and that will remain problems long after this agreement is signed. Things such as land distribution, reconciliation, and the fact that the government essentially conceded on some less contentious points, but didn't address some of the larger issues around ethnic cleansing and ongoing violence. So this is a case study that really highlights some of the challenges with not taking issues seriously when peace agreements are more of an elite bargain that focuses on perhaps setting up positions for those involved in the negotiations, but not thinking about some of the key issues that are at the center of the actual conflict. But then a contrasting example we see in the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in Colombia, which was signed in 2016, and that remains in force and has been for 8 years now, and this agreement included sort of detailed commitments and provisions that really map closely onto a lot of the demands that the armed groups raised, things like land reform, political and civic rights, DDR accountability. and also saw the development of sort of trust building and oversight mechanisms within the agreement that signaled government commitment to address issues. And focusing on sort of the negotiation process, we see a much clearer red thread between the issues raised and the way that the agreement was structured after a long peace process. So these are two sort of contrasting examples of the way that a negotiation process can play out and where conflict issues fit into that process. And there are sort of some lessons we can take away from this for practitioners and policymakers, which we've thought about as thinking through the life cycle of a conflict resolution process. So some different points along the way that issues can be really useful for thinking about. The first is starting even before a conflict begins to think about conflict prevention, the way that one can identify emerging issues and sort of identify the key demands or concerns that can help to prevent escalation in the future. Although if a conflict is ongoing, we think that the issues data can really help to understand both the nuances of what is actually being demanded, which is something that can get lost in the discussion, especially in sort of the within an ongoing conflict. What are the actual demands that the groups are focusing on, but also how these evolve over time. How do certain issues become important during certain periods of conflict, and perhaps demands shift over time to see that evolve. And then, as I mentioned before, the potential for learning from comparable cases to seeing how things have been handled in other contexts where similar issues are important, both where they have been handled well and perhaps where they have not been handled so well. And then thinking forward to the negotiation and resolution process, understanding issues in more detail gives us the opportunity to sort of find common ground and think about creative solutions, perhaps places where the conflict parties do have some potential for making agreements to sort of get negotiations started, to move things forward. And to think of ways that there are some creative solutions that get at these sort of areas of common ground, but also ensuring that agreements actually do address issues, that they are focusing on these sort of primary demands. And then finally, thinking forward to the implementation process of how we can, within the conflict reconstruction and rebuilding process, how to continue addressing these issues, since they don't typically just magically go away when a conflict is resolved. So thinking about how those issues carry forward into the post-conflict period. And lastly, returning to some of the sort of key messages of this report, again, that issues matter for conflict resolution. So on average, addressing a larger share of conflict issues leads to longer lasting peace. And that this is a sort of an additional factor that has received less focus in the literature so far, that can help us move towards sustainable peace, in addition to thinking about bargaining dynamics and including certain provisions and implementation of a peace agreement, but that this deserves greater focus. Because ultimately we see that good understanding of the issues and demands that a rebel group raises enables us to craft good, sustainable, long-lasting, peaceful solutions. Thank you.
Kate, I will ask you to stick here for a few minutes. I have a follow-up question or two before we continue. Thank you very much for that presentation of the EBA reports that you very concisely presented here. I would also like to remind you that all the reports we discuss here today are available on EBA's webpage. I mean, the takeaway here, you you mentioned that the core message is really that issues matter for conflict resolutions, and you reminded us of this here in the end. But yet we sort of see how international mediators and donors often tend to fall into this sort of actor-centric trap when it comes to handling these issues. Why do you think that is the case?
Yeah, well, the actors are, of course, very important as well, and they often tend to be the most visible and focal points of a negotiation process. And within a negotiation, it's also it is a lot of management of different actors and personalities, getting people to come to the table, managing the dynamics within the negotiation room becomes sort of a perhaps necessary short-term focus. And I think our argument is that we also need this grounding of understanding issues to come with that, so we don't sort of get lost in the day-to-day process of a negotiation, but also thinking about what these discussions actually mean situated within the larger conflict.
And do you have any recommendations for the, for instance, international organizations, mediators, to focus more, to keep this issue-based approach more closer, more relevant in the process?
Yeah. I think a lot of this comes down to sort of the underlying understanding that you take into a negotiation process. So developing this understanding of what the issues are, and perhaps how the actual demands may differ from the way a warring party is talked about in the media, or the way they perhaps frame themselves within a negotiation process. So coming in with that more detailed understanding, so that this can be sort of a thing to go back to, a grounding point within the negotiation process, to what does this piece of the deal actually speak to within the conflict issues.
All right. We will get back to how various actors working in the field, civil society organizations working in foreign aid, and so forth, can work with this and keep this issue-based approach in mind. We'll get back to that towards the end of the seminar. But first, thank you, Kate, for this presentation.
Thank you.
And with that, we will move on to Zoom, actually, where Janina Kotayuki should be online already. Here she is. Warm welcome to you. Janina Kotayuki is a senior researcher at the Center for Security Studies in Zurich, and she's an author of the dissertation brief From Confrontation to Cooperation, the United Nations Engagements with Non-State Armed Groups. Warm welcome to you on the screen, Janina. We will sort of have the same approach here. We will start with a brief presentation from you and then a few follow-up questions from me. So please, Janina, go ahead.
Thank you so much. Let me just see that I share my screen and presentation. Here we should go. So hi everyone, I'm very happy to be on board in this panel, and thank you so much for the introduction. I'm Janina Kotayuki. I'm a senior researcher at Center for Security Studies at ETH in Zurich, and also affiliated with the Department of Peace and Conflict Research at Uppsala University, as the other speakers there as well. Too bad I couldn't join you in person, but I'm very happy to present my dissertation brief called From Confrontation to Cooperation, the United Nations Engagement with Non-State Armed Groups. So, as many of you in the room know, who follow international peace and security, or kind of politics globally as a whole, non-state armed groups, rebel groups that Kate has talked about, but also different type of militia, local self-defense groups, play an important role in conflict context locally, but also in international politics. Recent examples from the Middle East, such as Hezbollah and Hamas, kind of bring examples into mind. So these type of groups, they use violence against government and state actors, also sometimes against civilians, but they also have kind of a lot of governance, political and other non-violent structures in place. So they might establish police forces, they sometimes provide aid or hinder aid from being delivered, but also have kind of political agendas. So knowing the importance of these groups, it becomes rather clear that organizations that aim to address international peace and security or operate in conflict-affected contexts often need to take into account such groups. And actually, we know that the mechanisms through which peacekeeping, but also peace building, some development projects, or kind of more humanitarian type of efforts often require cooperation or nonviolent engagement with different type of local actors, and this also include non-state armed groups, often in conflict contexts. Even though these groups are important locally and internationally, it's difficult to engage with such groups. It might be difficult to engage non-coercively, so without using force or violence, because these type of approaches could provide legitimacy to the insurgents and their claims. This can be politically very difficult. Donors may impose restrictions on such engagement, and not least so given kind of recent developments in the terrorism regimes and legislations. But at the same time, violent engagement or using force against such groups is also not very popular, requires resources and troops that states might be hesitant to give to international organizations or intervene themselves. So kind of this brings us to key questions of this dissertation, which is then how, why, and under what conditions does here the United Nations specifically engage with non-state armed groups? And here I focus on the United Nations, but I kind of try to broaden up the discussion to other actors as well, because I believe that for the United Nations, this type of political costs and many of these kind of practical costs might be even more severe than for other type of actors, such as civil society organizations, and kind of thus highlight issues related to this topic. I also focus more on the non-coercive engagement, so not using force to induce behavioral change, because this is some aspect that has been analyzed less previously. The focus is both on UN engagement at high kind of diplomatic level at the Security Council and on the ground, especially in peace operation contexts. So my dissertation consists of 4 independent essays that I summarize in the brief that I hopefully you get either physically there in person or you can find online. And in the first essay, I kind of outline a conceptual framework that tries to help us understand how these interactions between non-state armed groups and the UN in peace operation context might actually look like by looking at 2 different mission contexts, Cote d'Ivoire and Mali. And I map UN Secretary General progress reports, so UN documents, and look at what does the UN tell us about these type of interactions. And I argue and find that 2 dimensions are important when considering these interactions. One is the theme or problematic area of the interaction, so human rights, security, political process, or humanitarian aid efforts, and the other is the type of interaction. So in addition to focusing on confrontations or kind of these type of violent interactions, we need to also look at coordination where actors share information, and cooperation where they actually implement joint activities. And what I find that actually, even though these documents are political products and the UN might be hesitant to reveal interactions, confrontational interactions in both missions are actually less prevalent than previously highlighted. And instead of kind of confrontations in the security field that we can imagine, for instance, happening a lot in the case of Mali, which is kind of one of these stabilization missions, we also have a lot of cooperation, so joint activities especially in Côte d'Ivoire when it comes to security-related issues. So the UN mission was training rebel forces and implementing joint patrolling with them to create kind of local security. And in MINUSMA, there was a lot of focus on political cooperation to kind of push forward the political process. And here is some examples from Mali, where on the horizontal line, you can see the nature of interaction, so from confrontation to cooperation, and the different kind of programmatic thematic fields on the vertical line. And here we can see that examples of cooperation, for instance, in the human rights field, the UN managed to make rebels in the north to commit to a command order prohibiting the use of the recruitment of child soldiers, and in the political process, for instance, sign an agreement to hold elections and inclusive peace talks, kind of underlying the implications that this type of interactions might have in the local context for civilians and for peace processes. In the second essay, I turn into this diplomatic type of high-level engagement, and me and my co-author analyze speeches by UN security member states in the Security Council. We go over 50,000 speeches and look at how states, both elected members and permanent 5 members, condemn non-state armed groups for different type of behavior. And we find that that type of naming and shaming non-state armed groups for the tactics that they use is actually a very prevalent practice. Also, although previously this has been considered as a way to kind of induce human rights compliance, mainly by states. So we see that the Security Council member states often condemn non-state armed groups for different purposes. However, we find that the motivations for the P5 compared to the E10 for doing so differ a lot, and the states don't actually seem to do this to induce compliance necessarily, but to rather get strategic benefits for themselves in the Council. So, whereas the permanent 5 members kind of use this naming and shaming of non-state armed groups to support the governments that are engaged in civil wars against these groups and that are their partners, the elected 10 members actually seem to name and shame groups that commit most violence against civilians. So whereas the P5 use kind of the council to support their strategic partners, and gain power in the eyes of the international community through these tactics, for the E10, naming and shaming non-state armed groups can be a way to commit to civilian protection norms and kind of perhaps aim to make these groups comply. Here we can see some development throughout the years in terms of the naming and shaming of non-state armed groups, and now we have expanded the data further. And the prevalence of naming and shaming non-state armed groups have increased even further. That's the line that you can see more dark. Now to the third essay that again turns into peace operation contexts, and that tries to explain the conditions under which the UN then non-coercively engage with non-state armed groups. So under what conditions does it coordinate? So exchange information and cooperate, implement joint activities on the ground. And I look at this type of engagement in the context of southern Lebanon. I've used existing literature to analyze this, but also conducted fieldwork and interviews in Lebanon to look further into it. Also did some interviews and background work in New York, finding that simply 3 kind of mechanisms explain such engagement, mainly in the context of southern Lebanon, but I believe that these mechanisms also take place beyond the context. So quite simply, kind of as alluded before, when non-state armed groups govern locally, so when they have power politically and governance-wise in localities, the UN simply needs to cooperate with such groups in order to be able to implement its mandate, its activities, gain access to populations, and respond to needs of communities. However, in addition to kind of very operational, practical considerations, the UN is also continuously interested in building a legitimacy and gaining trust among local populations, not least because this also enables future operational effectiveness, but that when non-state armed groups have actually genuine support among civilians, which is sometimes the case across conflict contexts across the globe, the UN can actually benefit and gain this type of trust and legitimacy capital by engaging with non-state armed groups. Similarly, as we see in Lebanon, but also in other contexts, sometimes non-state armed groups are very embedded in the civilian populations. It's hard to know who is a member of what group, if they are a member, if they're a civilian, and there is this also very embedded support structures. The UN sometimes may coordinate and cooperate in order to avoid resistance from the population. So not only to kind of gain trust and access and be able to operate, but also simply to not be resisted and thus also kind of have more security for itself. And lastly, we turn into the fourth essay, where I conducted interviews and survey with Swedish military personnel deployed to MINUSMA. And I wanted to know, how do the peacekeepers actually understand non-state armed groups and their inclusion, but also in addition to non-state armed groups, kind of other local and civilian actors more broadly. And we find that actually the key local actors that these peacekeepers consider are military actors, kind of underlying that when we talk about the local, when we talk about ownership, it's often actually for some actors also involve non-state armed groups. And we find that the peacekeepers find the inclusion of these actors kind of through operational necessity. So they argue that they can gain direct benefits in terms of their own security, in terms of civilian protection, by engaging with some of these non-state armed groups. Kind of emphasizing how important just these armed actors are for the military peacekeepers' tasks, maybe not so surprisingly. However, despite these benefits that there might be, in practice it remains challenging to engage, partly because these peacekeepers have relatively little knowledge about these groups beforehand, and they have a hard time identifying which groups are hostile towards the mission, which groups should they engage with. They simply told me that they use very kind of ad hoc practical signs of either group flags, but sometimes just what type of pants they are using to understand if these groups are so-called terrorist groups or other types of groups, for instance. So kind of this more broader strategic vision is often missing. So just to highlight some of the key findings and to conclude, I think one of the key findings from this dissertation is that although there is a lot of critique, sometimes from state actors, from donors, and in generally kind of political costs of engaging with non-state armed groups, the UN frequently opts to do so, partly due to the operational benefits, but also ideas about, impartiality, legitimacy on the ground. I think it is really clear that non-state armed groups have important implications for international organizations or for development organizations, for NGOs operating conflict-affected areas. But the decisions to interact or engage are actually often made at the very operational or even individual level, and there is a lack of support and understanding when it comes to kind of more strategic, longer term involvement. And I think in general, in the broader field, we need to enhance our understanding of non-state armed group tactics and recognize the roles that these groups play, not only in terms of using violence and kind of challenging states, but also the roles that they play for civilians and the kind of realities that organizations that work on the ground need to face when engaging with these groups. Thank you so much, and I would be happy to continue the conversation by email, in addition to just maybe some of the questions right now. So don't hesitate to reach out in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that brief, Janina, for your and for your dissertation brief as well. I just have one follow-up questions to you. You mentioned here that for obvious reasons there are quite a few pitfalls that actors can fall into while engaging with NSAGs. How would you recommend Swedish development cooperation's approach when it is in cases where it is necessary to interact with these actors?
I think definitely based on especially the knowledge that I have through these cases of Lebanon and Mali and kind of talking to UN and the New York, I think we need a comprehensive understanding of what the specific groups are in the context that Sweden works, and this does not only cannot be a one-off brief or one-off effort to try to understand the local conflict dynamics or sensitivities, but this needs to be a continuous effort as groups change priorities, change tactics, change symbols all the way on the ground. So first is really generating knowledge before even being active on the ground. What is there to be faced, and then continue this knowledge generation. I also think it's extremely important to understand kind of this should not be only headquarters driven, but understand what are the necessities on the ground to really make this engagement practical and functioning for those who are working in the context. I would also add that given kind of the political sensitivities and different approaches by different states, working in such contexts, I think it's also important to aim to coordinate among international actors in those contexts, so that there is a little bit more holistic approach when it comes to engagement.
Thank you very much for that, Janina. So generating knowledge is the foremost example here, and that is what this seminar is about and what your brief is about as well, and I encourage all of you to read it. With that, we would like to thank you, Janina, and I would like to invite all of you to the coffee break. We will reconvene here again in 20 minutes at 2:40. Thank you, Janina.
Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the break and had time to have some coffee, even though it was very clear that this is a crowded seminar. It is time for our next presentation of a dissertation brief. And with us here to do so, we have Gulla Olofsdottir. You're a researcher at the Stockholm Center of Global Governance, the Political Science Department at Stockholm University, and also author of the EBA dissertation brief, Precarious Path to Democracy, Electoral Violence and the Struggle for Democratization. So please, Gulla, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you for that introduction. So yes, my name is Guðlaug Ólafsdóttir, and those are my affiliations, as you've already heard. I'm going to present a summary of my dissertation that I defended in November last year at the Department of Peace and Conflict Research. So just to kind of give you a little bit of an idea of where the idea for this research comes from, is the observation that despite the fact that we have elections in most countries in the world and have had for quite a few decades, democracy has kind of failed to take root in many of those countries. And this map I've borrowed it from VDEM's latest report. The VDEM Institute is based in Gothenburg. And as you can see here, so the red represents authoritarian countries at the moment, and a large amount of the countries in the world are currently actually autocratizing, so becoming more and more autocratic. And what I wanted to do in this dissertation is understand a little bit better what the role that electoral violence plays in this development. So the yellow dots on this map represent events of electoral violence, and it kind of shows how widespread this phenomenon is, and how concentrated it is in those countries that have also kind of stagnated democratically. So of course I recognize that there's direct effects of electoral violence for democracy. Electoral violence inherently undermines electoral integrity and has severe implications for anyone that is subjected to it. But what I want to explore in this dissertation is, are there additional kind of knock-on effects or indirect effects that electoral violence can have for the development of democracy in different places? Just to kind of give you an idea of how electoral violence is different from armed conflict. So we've, in the previous two presentations, heard more about armed conflict in the traditional sense. Here, electoral violence is a little bit different. So it's distinguished by these factors that I've noted here. So primarily the motives are a little bit different. They relate to electoral violence tends to try and shape the electoral outcome or the electoral process. It tends to take place in close to the elections in time, and it's carried out towards electoral targets. So voters, politicians, party supporters, campaigners, polling stations, rallies, these kind of things. The actors are also a lot broader than in regular armed conflict, so we include party supporters also here as perpetrators of violence. Criminal groups often collude with politicians for mutual gains. But then there's also the types of actors that we see in other types of armed conflict, such as security forces. Non-state armed groups also sometimes carry out acts of electoral violence, and so on. The type of violence that's included is also a little bit broader in scope. So we often include intimidation, threats, coercive acts that are non-lethal, apart from those that also do lead to fatalities, which tend to be the focus in research on armed conflict per se. So the contribution that I make in this dissertation is exploring these kind of indirect pathways through which electoral violence risks undermining democratization. I focus on citizens, political parties, and constitution making primarily. This is because, so the focus on constitution making is because these are processes where there's a potential for a development of democratic institutions, and this is where kind of the foundation of the state is up for negotiation. So it's an opportunity for democratization and has been used as such by the international community for a while. Then apart from that, I also go kind of one step further to explore how constitution making might be able to reduce electoral violence in its aftermath. I also disaggregate between the perpetrators to the extent that I can in the different studies to recognize that election-related violence carried out by the government can have quite different implications than this same type of violence, but by opposition actors. I've tried to use these icons to kind of illustrate a little bit or help guide where the different studies fall or where the focus is in the different studies of the dissertation. So the dissertation consists of 4 different articles, and I'll just run you briefly through the main findings and arguments in them. So the first one sets the stage for the other studies in the dissertation. It just looks at kind of the overall trends and patterns that we see globally. So it's a statistical study where I explore what the difference between having consecutive peaceful elections is compared to having consecutive violent elections. And I'm building on research and ideas that were first put forward by Staffan Lindberg about this idea that repeated experience with elections can kind of foster greater democratization by encouraging learning and capacity development among citizens, among political parties, civil society groups, and so on, and where they can kind of encourage the government to implement more democratic reforms. My argument is that that might be the case, but only if elections are actually peaceful. The findings of the study corroborate or are in line with what I hypothesize, that peaceful elections are associated with growth in democratization. However, when you have violent elections, we don't see any such association. And I explore the mechanisms a little bit, and it seems that the association between peaceful elections or kind of repeated experience with peaceful elections is associated with increasingly democratic practices among political parties, increasing civil society participation, and that is in turn associated with increases in democracy. When we look at kind of citizen level outcomes instead, so turnout, it seems that violent elections hamper this. So as people experience more and more violent elections, they come to associate elections with more danger and refrain from voting to a greater extent. The second study is co-authored with Hanna Fjelde, who was also my supervisor and the PI for the team that I did my PhD in. And here we're looking more at the individual level, trying to understand how people's support for democracy is influenced by experiences with violence or having violence in their direct context, specifically government-related violence. Our argument is basically that how citizens are impacted by this, or how their support for democracy is impacted by violence, depends on the partisanship of the citizen. So we find support for this, that when there is government-perpetrated violence in the proximity of opposition supporters, they tend to show stronger support for democracy. So they kind of double down on their support for democracy in these contexts. We don't see such trends among incumbent supporters or non-partisans, and we think that this has really important implications for the opportunity to actually bring about greater democracy through accountability mechanisms. Because if the incumbent supporters aren't kind of reacting to the violence that they see, and they actually have significantly lower levels of support for democracy to begin with, then that has negative implications for the development of democracy in those places. The third paper is a little bit different. So this one is based on field research that I did in 2023 in Turkey, where I was exploring a constitution-making process, particularly the failure of a constitution-making process. So it was, to begin with, portrayed as this hopeful opportunity. All of the political parties that were active in parliament at the time were involved, and they had negotiations over several years. But sadly, the process didn't work out in the end, and I wanted to understand what role violence played in kind of undermining that process. My argument is that I think that violence kind of exacerbated polarization and exacerbated distrust among the political parties in this process, and that this kind of interacted with electoral incentives of these parties to kind of play on this polarization, or at least to take the polarization into account. So the kind of discussion that I have in this study, which is much more qualitative in nature than the rest of them, is that, well, electoral politics do kind of emphasize these issues of polarization and distrust that stem from violence, or that are exacerbated by violence at the very least. But that I think that concessions could be fostered by efforts which kind of relate to what Kate was talking about before, such as efforts to depolarize and to build trust between the parties. So refraining from violence, for example, could have potentially had an effect, and listening to showing that there was some understanding between the parties. Of course, violence is only one of many reasons that this process didn't work out. And yeah, of course, I recognize that design choices matter a lot, as well as other types of dynamics. This is just one piece of the puzzle. The fourth study is on constitution making as well, but it kind of flips the causal order of what I'm looking at. So here I'm instead interested in how does constitutional reform, or here specifically constitutional replacements, so constitution making processes, or processes where constitutions are kind of being renegotiated completely, how or under what conditions can they actually contribute to a decline in electoral violence? And this comes from a recognition that the institutional landscape of a country really shapes the likelihood that we see electoral violence in different places. And my argument is that constitution making or constitutional replacements can foster a decline in electoral violence if they're the result of a negotiated agreement between different parts, because sometimes constitutional reforms are very much pushed through by dominant actors in the government, for example. And if they enhance constraints on the executive. I find partial support for this. So I find that negotiated agreements are associated with a decline following the reform, but only for government-perpetrated violence, which I think also makes sense given that the government is more constrained by the formal institutions of the state, perhaps. However, I don't find support for the addition of executive constraints kind of across the board. Instead, there's only one that sticks out, and that is removing the executive's ability to enact a state of emergency, which I also think makes sense given that a lot of governments use a state of emergency to kind of legitimize the use of repression of their populations. Interestingly, though, I do not see a similar effect among other actors, and I'm happy to talk more about that if you like. I think that this has to do with partially that this is a broad group of actors that can act quite differently. So it might be the case that opposition violence by opposition parties declines, whereas violence by criminal groups does not, for example. But I also think that there's an important distinction here to be made between how governments are impacted by institutional reform compared to other actors in society. Okay, so in sum, the policy implications resulting from my dissertation are broadly that, well, of course, addressing electoral violence is an important part of democracy promotion, or needs to be an important part of democracy promotion. That also democracy promotion is perhaps particularly important among the supporters of the government and non-partisans, because often the opposition is already convinced of the need for greater democracy, whereas government supporters seem to be less so. Similarly, constitution-making processes need to be designed in a way that takes into account the polarization and distrust that exists in society, and particularly between those that are involved in those kind of negotiations. I also think it's important to note that constitution-making processes do seem to have the kind of opportunity to reduce or to reduce government-perpetrated electoral violence, at least. But that this only kind of occurs under certain circumstances when these processes are actually inclusive, involve true negotiations and agreements between kind of across divides. And lastly, that addressing electoral violence by government and opposition actors seems to require distinct means. And I think that that's an important takeaway as well, that the reasoning behind electoral violence differs based on the actor that's actually carrying it out, and the implications of their violence also differs for different people. So yeah, I'll round it up. I just wanted to say also that so currently I'm continuing to work on similar topics, but more still on kind of electoral politics and dynamics within semi-authoritarian regimes. But I'm shifting more towards election boycotts and kind of the causes and implications of them, and autocratization's impact on international cooperation. So studying this more at the kind of in the global arena, and I would be very happy to talk to anyone that's interested in any of these topics, either what I presented in the brief today or any of these other ones at any stage. So feel free to reach out.
Thank you for that, Gulla. Quick follow-up question. Your brief, it sort of challenges the idea that elections naturally lead to increased democratizations. In that case, should, and if yes, how, should democracy assistance programs adapt themselves and should they rethink their work when it comes to promoting elections as democratization tools?
I mean, I think, like I argue in the first paper, I do think that there is an opportunity there to foster greater democracy through the practice of elections, but that it really matters how the elections are carried out. So if democracy efforts kind of are promoting or kind of focusing on elections, they need to focus on the integrity of the elections, how, mitigating fraud, making sure that there's an even playing ground, and of course addressing violence by any actors that might be employing such tactics. So yeah, prevention of electoral violence, I think, needs to be central in those efforts.
And in that case, should the focus go more from supporting elections just for the case of elections to supporting, say, trust, inclusion, and various tools to decrease polarization?
Absolutely, I think that's essential also between elections. I think in order to foster greater democratization, addressing polarization is one of the central topics that needs to take place. And that's, I think, what came out very clearly when I was looking at constitution making. So here I was looking at constitution making, but that involves negotiations between political parties. And this wasn't necessarily relating to elections per se, but of course they're impacted by both the polarization between the political parties themselves and those representatives, and the polarization in society between the groups that they're representing. So it needs to kind of take place at all levels, these kind of depolarization efforts.
At all levels and across time, I imagine, not just ahead of elections.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's a long-term effort. I don't think it can be done just before elections only, sadly.
Right. Thank you very much for that, Gulla. You will soon come back to the stage, but before, thank you.
Thank you.
And it has now become time for our last dissertation brief, and I would like to welcome Juan Diego Duque Salazar to the scene. You are a researcher at the Department of Peace and Conflict Research, Uppsala, you as well, and the author of the dissertation briefs, Why do some politicians withdraw from politics while others do not in violent elections? So Juan, please.
Hello, hello. Let me see. Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for being here and still being the last presentation. Today, I'm very happy to present you with this dissertation brief that it's called Why Do Politicians Withdraw from Politics While Others Do Not in Violent Elections? So during my 5 years of PhD, I was very intrigued with this question. My dissertation, it's more a monograph, so it's not as a paper based, but more like trying to get much more in depth into one of these questions. So this question is very important because we are seeing today's escalation of threat of violence against politicians. You here see two different pictures of maybe more well-known cases of the assassination attempt of Donald Trump, but also the actually assassination of presidential candidate in Ecuador, Fernando Villavicencio. But of course, these are very high-profile cases. We also have a lot of these cases more at the local level or regional level. This is the case of Claudia, a politician who I interview, who have also experienced a lot of different threats during their career. And when she was running for the first time, she was very up front saying, no matter how the threats, I will continue. And in fact, when I was talking with her, she was saying that for her it was very important to create this banner, basically meaning that they offer the criminal organization that was threatening her more than 100,000 euros for killing her. But then she said, I'm here without fear, I will continue. And I think this is very striking example of like how many of those politicians are wanted to continue. And the question is, how is this possible and why they are continuing? So to start with this, to try to bring a little bit of ideas on that, there are two main concepts that are very clear in this, very important in this dissertation: electoral insecurity, meaning those all forms of violence that politicians experience, especially those that are occurring during the political campaigns or electoral violence, that as Gula was describing. So all forms that are physical or non-physical forms, psychological forms as well, violent threats, but also indirect attacks, meaning those who are also that you could see during the political campaigns. Your peers are being attacked, and that increase the way on how you perceive the way of how the campaigns are going for many of those politicians who are campaigning. And the second concept is political ambition. So the decision, the desire, the willingness to run for office. Whether is it the violence are affecting on how it's related with political ambition. And I am very interested specifically understand how political ambition is affected after a campaign has happened. So it's not about the ambition after, like the first time that you're maybe decided or interested to run, but it's after what happened the campaign. So these are two central concepts that I want to try to understand how they relate to each other. To study this question and these two concepts, I basically do qualitative and quantitative. Oh, wow. Okay, it changed now, so you could probably not see much, but basically says quantitative data and qualitative data. So it's a multi-method research based on candidate survey data on local elections 2023 in Colombia, when more than 9,000 candidates that I collected with the Electoral Observant Mission in Colombia, and qualitative data in a specific region. I don't know if you could see here, which is one of the regions that has been more affected by violence against politicians in Colombia. So I go there, talk with many politicians, trying to understand, and also join their campaigns, follow for around 1 month, trying to see how they are campaigning in very risk areas. So why Colombia? I mean, I think Colombia is well known. Unfortunately, I'm Colombian, so it's not a good thing to say that, but it's because the violence, but it's also where many of these politicians are experiencing many forms of violence. So 0.5% of the politicians who reported in the survey that I conducted report any form of violence. It's actually around 6,000 people in local elections saying that. They experience very different forms of violence: physical attacks, assassination attempts, vandalism against their propaganda, against their property, intimidation, online harassment, violent threat, and also sexual violence. So it's indeed very, very spread around the country, and very intriguing, that still there are many doing and taking the risks for continuing in politics. So to start with the findings, one is that indeed electoral insecurity decreases political ambitions. So this is not maybe as a big surprise, but of course there are many with still, that they prefer not to go. Why? In many of these areas where there is a lot of high electoral insecurity, there is a lot of the violence increase the campaign costs, meaning that they need to invest in armor cars, bulletproof vests, bodyguards, because always the state doesn't provide the security that they are expecting. But then also means non-material cost or non-material campaign cost, meaning, for instance, all the psychological load that means to actually campaign in these areas. So with that, it leads, to many to say actually they don't want to continue. So a quote from an interview says, no, I won't run again. It's extremely tough to do politics. If it is it is for mental health, I would rather not run again. So this is very prominent in some of those who are not able. But and here I will continue with, why do they continue? And that's probably one is the main contribution of this dissertation, is to understand how they are able to continue despite all of this violence. So one of the answers is that in Colombia there is a way in how you're doing political campaigns, which I denominate, or the literature denominates more, what is called political machines. Political machines are informal political networks that works within the political parties that are in charge for voter mobilization, political control, and accessing security. These informal ways on how you create political networks includes, for instance, doing a lot of clientelistic exchanges, and those are very, very expensive informal networks. Those networks provides you with campaign funding, with information or security information, and protection measures, including violence specialists that will protect you, but also it could also help you to intimidate or politicians that are competing with you. I denominate when you are part of these political networks, I denominate this process as more the bulletproofing effect of the political machines. So machines mitigate the effects that is raised by the violence, so the campaign cost. Sorry for the mismatch here for the fonts. And I want to give you a little bit of the texture of what it means, these political machines. So this is a political rally. You have many people there from a neighborhood in Colombia, in Caquetá. Many of these are brokers that are hired by the politicians to mobilize the voters to these political rallies. They provide bingos, different material benefits. All of this, what I'm detailing, is very costly, right? When I was speaking with one of these brokers, she said, a broker that's working for a politician, she said, well, she, the politician, received the support from the political party. Her brother, so this informal political network, right, is very personalized, probably paid all the political leaders or the brokers so she could run the organized campaign. So when there's a lot of this money, you're able to hire all these political brokers to mobilize and bring the voters. But at the same time, you actually can get access to information. Information is very important. This is a photograph when one of the brokers is telling something to the candidate, and that's how all of this secret information of actually where the risks come from. Another quote of this interview says, "The people are the ones who tell me, come over, we want you here. Don't worry, we'll take care of you, protect you, take you here, and bring you back." So when you're campaigning in areas where a lot of the non-state armed groups are present and you don't know where the risk means to go in some of these areas, these brokers are very key in order to get protection. So partly of how he's doing that is because you hire them with the money, but also, so with the money, and then you get basically part of the information. But also part of this is the protection measures. This is a candidate in the middle who have two bodyguards. One is a private bodyguard, another one is a state bodyguard. When I was talking with the politicians, he said, often I need to actually invest money in order to have an additional bodyguard, additional in the state, because it's not enough what the state is providing me. So because in Colombia, there's a lot of these violent specialists, people who were ex-combatants, who maybe been part of the military, those are very accessible to some of these politicians through these networks. And then you use different protection measures that can facilitate them to be more protected. One of these quotes, for instance, say, I have to wear a pistol as a protective measure for my life. So it's a very, very risky, thank you, for environment, and they need to build these very, big informal networks in order to be protected. Those who are outside, and in here, well, it doesn't really see very well, but basically what I want to show here is that those who are outside of these networks usually are the ones who are more affected, and therefore they are the ones who are deciding not to continue in politics. So the second main finding is the machines mitigate the suppressive impact of violence on political ambition. Third, women candidates benefit more from the machines than men from. Women candidates benefit more than men from the protection of the informal political networks of the machine, and this actually came as an interesting finding, as I was expecting kind of the opposite. What happened here is that because in order to create of these informal networks, many of the when women enter in these networks, usually they have much less personal wealth and campaign for the campaigns, and few political networks compared to men. And therefore, when they enter to these political networks, they are able to actually use some of these resources. Compared to men who are outside of the machines, usually they actually not benefit the same way. They can rely on other resources in order to continue. Here, and it's something that also comes interesting, is many of these political networks actually are with many women working as the logistical work. They take a lot of the work of the organizing of the political campaigns, and over time they are gaining the trust of the big patrons in order to actually be able to continue. So that's the way in how some of these trust is gained in order to access to the political networks. Just a few pictures about how is this happening. And so to finish is to say that actually those women who are outside are the most vulnerable, outside of the machines, are the ones who are the most vulnerable from this they are more vulnerable from violence. So when violence hit, it's actually the ones who are more likely to decide to not continue. So thinking about these three main findings, right? Violence decrease political ambition. When you're part of these machines, you're protected. And third, women benefit more from these machines. I think we could make some conclusions about this. So one is that electoral insecurity undermines fundamental democratic principles of political fairness, right? Because we are not giving the equal right of everyone to participate in the same way. You need to be part of this very exclusionary politics in order to continue for longer time in politics, and also affects the inclusiveness. By examining informal political networks, I could disentangle the effects of violence, which are distinct, right? So political violence, or the violence that experience many of these politicians, are not equally affecting everyone. So usually are the newcomers who are not having these political networks, or they cannot access to these networks. And second, for women who are not entering also, or who are not part of these networks. So is indeed increasing probably these gender inequalities in politics when violence is very prominent in the environment. Violence also entrenched non-democratic women and men politicians. And I say women and men politicians because you stay in politics if you are taking part of these clientelistic practices in the political networks. And that is because it's the only way that you are, like, in order to continue with the violence, you need to reproduce the same practices in politics. So it reinforces the exclusionary politics. So we need to think about how to safeguard most vulnerable candidates or most vulnerable politicians, and we should think about bolstering inclusive political parties. So a lot of this discussion of the informal political network is about how weak are these political parties to actually create discipline, to keep their own political candidates, because they tend to switch as well a lot. So a lot of this is thinking about how to strengthen these political parties that are reproducing these very exclusionary politics in the case of Colombia. These dynamics are not unique in Colombia. Some of these examples, not specifically how we study here, could be seen in other parts of the region, as Ecuador, Honduras, Peru, but also far in other regions as in Indonesia, Philippines, or India, where many of these clientelistic or patronage networks are very prominent in the way and how politics is occurring, but at the same time, violence is very present. With that, I just finished. Thank you very much. You have here my email. The dissertations is indeed much more broader. So if you're interested to have an access more directly to the dissertation, please feel free to contact me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juan, for that. I think that many of you who are here today have thought about the fact that Juan's dissertation brief comes very timely on a very timely day in Sweden when a top politician resigned due to threats. So I wonder, given your findings, especially in this field, how can aid and democracy program ensure that violence doesn't systematically exclude women from political life?
So I think that when I think there is a lot about working with the political parties. My impression sometimes is that the international, like when we think about Colombia and a lot of the work on peace building, you usually exclude actually political parties from it. Part of the survey data shows that most of the politicians report that the violence comes from the other politicians, but not from the non-state armed actors. So I think that a lot of this like very threatening work needs to be, how to create this inclusive political parties where the institutions are able to discipline politicians, let's say. So if you are threatening others, you need to go away from the party. But I think because these parties are very weak, they don't really promote this inclusiveness.
So it's about working with the parties and mechanisms within the political parties, so to say. And I mean, your findings, they focus on Colombia. As you mentioned, it has a history of violence and a high level of violence. But considering the rise of political violence globally and also in parts of the world where it hasn't been present for the past decades or perhaps centuries, how can international democracy aid incorporate these types of lessons that you mentioned from Colombia?
Well, I mean, I think that I think that what probably is very important is to think about how this election violence actually take place, and how we could think about that institutions are very important to protect, and the democratic institutions. And I think that Gula was mentioning some of these before. So I think that thinking that when our democratic institutions are being weakening, we are increasing also the rise of violence. So how we could strengthen those democratic institutions. So that I would think about that, how maybe the international community.
And that's a long-term effort, I
Indeed.
gather. All right.
Indeed.
Thank you for that, Juan. You can stay here. And with that, I would like to welcome our other presentators who are here physically, and also our two discussants here to the stage. And we'll try to make room for all of us. Okay. Does that work?
Sure.
Yeah.
Kind of, sort of. All right. Okay. Thank you. Welcome back, Gulla and Kate. And also welcome to you, Janni and Christopher. And I thought that I will ask the two of you who are here as discussants to first react to what you have heard here, but also provide your input and perhaps if you have some questions to our presentators. So we'll start with you, Janni Lilja, and to remind our audience, you're the Deputy Director or Kansliråd at the Department of UN Policy, Conflict Issues and Migration at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Thank you so much, Katarina, and thanks to EBA for hosting and for amazing presentations. So there's a lot to take in here, but I would really like to pick up on your study, Kate, on conflict issues, because we are facing a challenge today in the world in moving from ceasefires to more durable and robust peace settlements. And even some of the most engaged mediators are openly expressing their frustration about this. And we currently see a lot of focus on the dynamics of conflict. We talk about humanitarian access, on the nature of warfare, and on prisoner exchanges, whereas we see a relatively little, a lack of attention or energy put on the underlying conflict issue. So I really want to thank you for putting the spotlight back on the issues of independence, on the land reform issues, on the minority rights dimension, and also what you brought up, Gulla, on constitutional reform aspects. I really believe that if we approach problems from an issue-based standpoint, we can also learn and transfer insights from one armed conflict to another. This is the way that we base our engagement on evidence and not reinvent the wheel, treating every conflict as an isolated case. I also thought when you were presenting, Kate, about the division of labor here between diplomacy and development. And it really struck me when you showed the goals section on that slide that really a number of these issues could be fruitfully addressed through more longer term accompaniment support approaches made possible through development cooperation. And perhaps that's where we need to focus even more going forward, and on combining those long-term structural systematic efforts with the diplomatic work. So that was really sort of one takeaway, and I would be curious also to hear your reflections on how we can move forward, more practically speaking, because now we have sort of more country-centered engagements when we analyze and try to see the presents a development offer at the country level, and how we can actually tap into some of this work that has been done on the conflict issues, and see how we can work sort of more systematically on that. So that's really sort of my starting point here. Then, of course, I had a number of other some questions that popped up in relation to your presentation, Gulla. You talked about sort of preventing election violence and creating a conducive environment for elections. But beyond constitutional change, do you have other possible avenues that could be explored? And then maybe to you, Juan, if you can reflect a little bit on the possibilities, but also the limits of external support, specifically to these intra-party processes. How you see the role of external actors being helpful in that regard. So thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Janni, and thank you for your questions. Also, we'll get back to them in a minute, and also to the overall discussion on how we should work together, various actors. That's an important point you raise. And now over to you, Christopher. You are an expert on peace and security at SIDA, so we're interested to hear your input.
Thank you so much. Am I standing okay for the cameras here? I just want to make sure. Yeah, not too much on the side here. Okay, good, excellent. Thank you so much, and thank you, EBA, and thank you for excellent presentations and reports. It's really helpful, and I want to say it from the beginning, I really strongly believe in linking research with policy making and practical implementation of development on the ground. I think we need to be better at that, and we need to do it more. So I think this is very much thanks to EBA for that also. What comes to my mind first on the first study, what are we fighting for? I mean, obviously we all know that there's nothing more harmful for development in any context than wars. So we have to do everything possible, obviously, to sustain peace, not only to reach a ceasefire, peace agreement, but to actually achieve sustainable peace. And at the core of this, which you emphasize, is to look at the conflict issues. That's why I'm so happy about this report. And I also say it because I fear that conflict analysis is disappearing a bit. I don't think we are doing it enough. I don't think we are doing it good enough. And I think we need to do it much more, also within the development cooperation. So this is a strong message, which I very much emphasize and agree with. I also think that because we within CEDA, we not only need to look at the conflict analysis when we sort of tailor different kinds of support, but we also have to look at conflict sensitivity. This is a term most of you know, of course. It's to do no harm, make sure that whatever we do doesn't harm the situation in the country, and in this context, it leads back to violence, back to wars and so on. But it also means to do good, not only do harm, to find good projects, good support, and to things that actually can enhance a peaceful development, which in this case very much is to address root causes. Look at the conflict issues. How can various kinds of support that we are giving actually address these root causes and sustain a more positive development? So I think these are interesting sort of aspects to keep putting forward. It's nothing new. We've been talking about this for ages, but it's a bit of a pendulum, these issues. It comes and goes a bit, and I feel strongly now, not least in these days, looking at what's happening in the Middle East with discussions on ceasefires, peace deals, or there are no agreements yet on peace and so on. But I mean, you have to look at the core issues in order to sustain things. And this is something I think we need to do also within our development cooperation a lot. So thank you for that one. The report on non-state armed groups made me so many thoughts to my head. I just came from working in Lebanon at the Swedish embassy there. I've been working in Palestine many years and in Syria and etc. And of course, as a government agency working at an embassy also, we of course are steered by who we can talk to and who we cannot talk to and who we can engage with and not. However, we support partners, we support UN, we support international NGOs and local civil society organizations, and they must in one way or the other interact with the powers on the ground, not least to achieve development or to deliver humanitarian aid or whatever it might be. But it comes back to what we said before also. You need to look at the conflict analysis in the support, especially in these kinds of contexts where there are non-state armed groups. You have to look at, again, the conflict sensitivity. How can you tailor and provide the support to make sure that you actually support a positive development, depending on which are the actors in powers and so on. So, and of course, in peace processes, when we look at different kinds of support in peace building and peace processes, non-state armed groups are crucial in order to reach settlements and so on. So here we of course link a lot, and we discuss a lot internally in CEDA also about the HDP nexus, the humanitarian development nexus, humanitarian development and peace nexus, how that interlinks. That becomes even more crucial, I think, in a context where there are non-state armed groups. So thank you also for putting that issue on the table. These issues are not going away. Just briefly summarizing on the electoral violence and why politicians decide to sort of leave election campaigns and so on, I think it's extremely complex how you provide development support in a democratization process. And of course, you do it to support civil society actors who can promote non-violence approaches and who can be watchdogs and these kind of things. You also can support media, who can have a crucial role in these kind of contexts to sort of deflame a bit of the situations. But also, as you mentioned, institutions, and to make sure that institutions also include addressing violence issues in election campaigns. And of course, obvious, I mean, we can send observers for elections. We don't do it at SID anymore, but the FBA does it, and here, of course, it's an important factor of that. So I think when we think about what kind of support we put into these sensitive processes, these things needs to be kept in mind, and I think that's what you helped with for today. You helped us to put these issues, and we can have them as sort of checklists or thoughts to think about when we look at partners' applications that come to us. So thank you so much, and again, nothing is more important than to sort of make sure that we look at sustainable developments on these issues. So thanks.
Thank you very much for that comment. I will start by letting our presenters react, comment, and answer the questions that were raised as well. And we'll start in the order as close to me. So we'll start with you, Kate. Thoughts, reflections, or also questions to our discussants?
Well, thank you so much. And I think that you've pointed to a very important kind of takeaway from this report, that this is the importance of issues is not necessarily a new thing, but it's something that we have perhaps buried a little bit in our understanding, and that this needs to have sort of equal thought as actors and behaviors and things like that. So thinking through where can issues come in for our sort of longer term understanding really came out from both of your comments, thinking sort of prior to conflict, during conflict, but also continuing afterwards, and where can sort of development aid come in to think about these issues. And you bring up a very good point about sort of the differentiation between diplomacy and development, and what different stages of a conflict process that can come in with. And I think greater attention to issues also shows us kind of the red thread through that process, that it's not simply sort of addressing certain issues within a peace negotiation, but it also continues as to how are those issues being addressed afterwards in sort of the post-conflict period, and ensuring that there is some focused effort on thinking about what are these drivers, these things that drive people to take up arms, but also are going to continue to be important needs and concerns after a conflict is resolved. So that's something key that I think our data can also help to support that longer term view. Thanks.
Thank you. Juan, thoughts, questions, and also there was a direct question to you about the limits of external support.
No, thank you for the questions as well, and the comments, because I think indeed it's a very difficult thing, or to think about how the development work could actually engage directly with political parties, because also that bring questions about neutrality, right? In systems where there is a very fragmented political party systems, you might have in Colombia you have around 30 parties working with all the parties at the same time. In order to show neutrality could be very difficult. So I think that some of the work I've seen that some development agencies have done is trying to promote training with politicians about democratic culture, and to think about how they could promote inside their own parties more democratic culture. So I think that in this way, promoting kind of like capacity building for the new people who are entering to the political arena might be a good way, but also maybe there are other experiences from where the development work is coming from. So how to do exchanges of different political parties with cultures that will promote a more inclusive political party structures. That it doesn't put or that try to keep that neutrality, because I think that's the kind of the dilemma for the development work with working with political parties.
Thank you. Gulla, your thoughts and questions, and also there was a question to you about sort of going beyond election violence, if there are other areas you would like to explore further.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for great comments, both of you. I appreciate all of the kind of the emphasis that you put on the importance of institutions and so on. And to your question, I think so. Addressing electoral violence is very complex because, especially the drivers of violence are quite different in different contexts, so it would require a context-specific analysis often. But I think generally, I agree with what Juan Diego was saying about the importance of political parties and their internal structures and their internal kind of accountability mechanisms, and but not only that, also the way that they sometimes foster polarization in society by the way that they talk to the populations. Sometimes polarization is used for electoral gain, but then it comes with this implication that there are deep rifts between groups in society that are developed that can be really difficult to address once that kind of messaging has been very kind of ingrained. But then I think it's really important to also address the opportunity structures for violence that exist in or that are in place. So these kind of collusions between criminal groups or networks and political parties or politicians, it's inherently very difficult to address because it often happens behind the scenes, very actively so. But the existence of criminal groups that employ violence is a risk factor that needs to be addressed because oftentimes these groups exist and are available to politicians to kind of tap into, and it's not uncommon that politicians buy the support for or purchase violence as a service carried out by groups that are already existing in the context. So kind of really fostering or trying to get rid of those opportunity structures is really important, but also very complicated. I do recognize. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that. And I would like to remind the audience that I will soon open up the floor for questions. So if you already know with you that you have a question, you can already now start raising your hands and I will start with the list. Okay, we have them. I'll open up soon then. Just a final question from myself. And this is primarily to Christopher and Gianni. You are here as practitioners. And you both sort of stress the need for research, the need for this type of knowledge in your work. But I wonder how can this type of research that combines field research and quantitative data be better integrated into real-time policy making processes, but also policy implementing processes that you are working with? How to make better use of it?
No, as I sort of hinted to, I do believe, but this is, of course, the responsibility of SIDA. When you come up carefully with a development offer, that sort of is often underpinned by more strategic analysis. And I see that the databases that exist here on the conflict issues could potentially be used in a systematic way. But beyond the SIDA, of course, we also have the Folke Bernadotte Academy that is also implementing Swedish strategies, both in countries and more thematically. So there's a lot of opportunity there, I think, to draw on this. I mean, the existing resources free of charge that are there and are available. So that I believe is very pertinent. And then, of course, we have also special envoys in some country or in relation to certain conflict situations that are, of course, very much helped and served by this kind of analysis, both that are being produced in Sweden, but also by international think tanks outside of Sweden. So I think we cannot or overestimate enough the importance of really drawing on the existing knowledge and insight when it comes to these quite complex, rapidly changing situations that we're witnessing, to get to make sense of really sort of what are the tectonic underlying forces that are driving a lot of the sort of manifestations of violence and instability that we're seeing.
No, absolutely. And I mean, we can use research like yours in every phase of our work. And I mean, we get strategies from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and from the government to achieve these goals. And then when we look at them, we cannot start thinking, so what works in order to achieve these goals? What evidence is there? What research is there in order to achieve these goals or not? This is something I think we have to integrate into our work, because that also then sets the basis of when we call for proposals and when we look for which partners to support. Are they really working in line with what the evidence in order to achieve those goals are? So that's on a very initial stage. Then, of course, in implementation, things change in these contexts, and they change quickly and rapidly. So I think if we can have a research takes time sometimes, right? But if we can have sort of an interlink and discuss during processes as well, I think that could be extremely helpful on policy briefs or whatever it might be that's coming. But then also the sort of last part, when we are to see, did our support really lead to any result? Did it really change anything on the ground? Did it really not only lead to lots of activities being done, but actually lead to an impact or an outcome somehow? And here we can sort of lean back towards, I think, research much more to sort of measure it compared to that somehow. These things sound maybe easy, they're not easy, and I think we need to find ways to sort of speak to each other also in same languages sometimes, to find common understandings of what do we mean with results, what do we mean with evidence, what do we mean with these kind of terms. But again, back to what I said before, I think we really need to interlink much more the research and the academia and the practitioners. That's the bottom point.
And a lot of the knowledge is already there, as you both point to. And one way to connect more is to come to seminars such as this one. With that, we have the time to open up for some questions. I saw the gentleman in the back. Please introduce yourself for the tape as well.
Thank you very much. My name is Johan Eldebo, and I work for the aid organization World Vision. And first, thank you very much for fantastic presentations. For me personally, this is very timely because on Saturday, I'm flying to the Central African Republic to do a joint interagency context analysis, looking amongst, on other things, how the upcoming election may or may not impact humanitarian aid in that country. And one topic that comes to mind here is the role of UN peacekeepers, and the fact that not just in that country, but elsewhere, we are seeing both an actual and imminent reduction in international presence in that regard. So my question to the highly esteemed panel here is, what do you think that will have? What kind of consequences will we see from that, from an international engagement perspective, when it comes to supporting free and fair and safe elections?
Thank you very much for that. We'll take one more question now and sort of get them together. We have the lady in the corner was first, I believe, next to the window.
Thank you. My name is Susanne Simolén. I work for the Åland Island Peace Institute, and I already told Kate Lonergan in the break that I think it's a great development that you have disaggregated the conflict issues. And my question is really to you, what's the next step in research? I'm thinking you presented the conflict issues in categories, and I know you have broken them down even more in your paper, but how to access the values and the issues behind those issues, and also how can is there something to learn also from non-violent groups like supporters to the same issues? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have more questions, but we'll start by answering these ones, and then I'll get to the following ones. Please, whoever feels compelled. There was a direct question to Kate and one more open. Yes.
I can take a quick stab at the first question on UN peacekeeping. It's highly worrying, given the research that does exist, and it's pretty unequivocally clear that UN peacekeeping, of course, not in every particular instance, but overall and in the aggregate, has resulted in diminished violence against civilians. And so it has saved lives on the ground, and because of sizable presence. And now when that is being reduced, we should expect to see, consequences that are negative. So that field of research is pretty robust, and it's not just one study. It's really sort of the one very clear piece of evidence from decades of UN peacekeeping studies.
I actually thinking that our supervisor Hanne Fjelde actually she has a paper about peacekeeping operations and election violence, and she also has shown that the presence of peacekeeping operations has decreased on election violence. So I think that it's just part of these big results that we might expect not very good future if we are also retrieving that important aid in the many of these countries that are suffering of election violence.
Kate, there was a direct question to you.
Thank you so much for your question. I think it's really exciting to think about what sort of next steps we can have in our research. And you've brought up two really good kind of questions around how different issues kind of hang together, or if there are sort of clusters of issues that can be seen across different contexts that tend to come together, and perhaps that can be addressed in together as well. So issues that sort of build off of each other in the resolution process. But thinking about peace agreements as well, I think one clear next step is to think about how peace agreements are implemented. So our study sort of looks at the first step: do issues get addressed and regulated within a negotiation process? But then sort of looking forward again, the step after that may be how are these issues that are regulated, how are they implemented in the long term, and where do the challenges come into actually seeing these issues addressed sustainably? So that's a very important question.
Yes, Christopher.
Can I jump in here?
Absolutely.
I'm so intrigued by this question. I'm following what's happening in the Middle East now, and I lived 10 years in Palestine, dealing with these issues. And I mean, we have to remind ourselves that most reasons for new wars are bad peace agreements. And in Gaza, we've had wars every third, second year following each other, just because the root causes have not been addressed. They have not been solved. So it's also very important for us to sort of spread this narrative somehow. I'm thinking about the discussion within media or within politics or among us also, that really to put forward what are the issues to be solved, because that's not what we are seeing right now. And it's quite strong forces against us that wants to promote the narrative that now it's peace, or now it's this. Now the actors have come together, like you're saying. But I just think it's so important to sort of look at these issues, so what's really behind them as well, and how to really address them. Because the achieved peace between Israelis and Palestinians is not only about Gaza, it's about East Jerusalem as well. It's about the borders, it's about the occupation, it's about the settlements, and it's about a whole host of different issues that the Oslo Peace Accord never solved. Never got to, somehow. So I mean, we just need to keep these things in mind when we're hearing these discussions in TV and in media. Sorry, I had to jump in on that because I think it's so important.
Thank you. That's a very specific example of the research in being applied in action, for instance. We had two questions here in the front, the gentleman and the lady next to him. And the rest of you, please raise your hands so I see everyone. High up with your hands, please. Okay, I see you.
Right, thank you everyone for some very interesting presentations. I feel I've certainly learnt a lot. My question is to Dr. Lonergan as a co-author of the EBA-report. And it got me thinking a little bit. The report seems to find, perhaps to no one's big surprise here, that really we need to address the root causes of conflict, at least as understood and advocated by the parties. And that got me thinking, what are the implications of this in terms of sort of recent trends in process design? Because it seems that more recently there's been a bit of a shift away from perhaps more comprehensive approaches to peace agreements on the basis that perhaps they're unwieldy, they're overly complex, they overly raise expectations which cannot be met. And there's a pushback against that towards perhaps more incremental and piecemeal approaches. And I'm wondering, is there anything from the report, and completely fine if there isn't, which could perhaps weigh against this, or perhaps it doesn't matter provided at the end of the day you do get towards addressing these issues? Thanks.
Thank you. And we'll take the question right next to you at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Moret Abobokhidze. I represent Georgian Association in Sweden. Thank you for wonderful presentations, and for someone who is coming from the country bordering Turkey and Russia, unfortunately, and the elections were falsified largely back in 2024 October, and since then we have ongoing demonstrations. And Gula, from your presentation, I could relate a lot to criminal groups, also to the constitutional amendments, and also actually from all your presentations I could relate a lot what's going on in Georgia. But what happened was that opposition parties, they have boycotted the results and they didn't enter the parliament. So what would be your recommendation or kind of finding in that case? Is it a good way of proceeding further, or should they find another way, so to say? Thank you. I know it's a very difficult question.
Thank you very much. We'll let you answer those two questions briefly, so we'll have time for a few more. The first one, Kate.
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. This is I think something we need to really take into consideration when studying peace agreements, that there was a trend for a while of these really comprehensive agreements, and now to split them up risks that sort of a few issues are addressed, or that maybe issues are partially addressed, but that this more comprehensive approach isn't actually taken up. I think the what we can see in the data is there's often, you can have sort of peace agreements that are split up into much smaller agreements that are taken together to kind of build on each other to address issues. If that is the way that negotiations are heading, that's one way to perhaps ensure that the issues are addressed. So it's not only about, is everything addressed in one piece of paper, but rather is the host of issues that the groups are fighting for, is it meaningfully addressed? Is it are people seeing that this issue is on the table? We're thinking about how to solve these issues. So if that can be done through a collection of individual agreements, that may push us more towards sustainable peace. We'll see if it goes that way.
Thank you. And Gula, a comment on the situation in Georgia.
Yes,
based on your knowledge.
Sadly, I'm no expert on Georgia per se, so it's hard for me to say exactly what would be the best strategy forward. But I do think, I mean, given that, so one of the projects that I'm working on at the moment is about election boycotts, not parliamentary boycotts, but kind of recognizing that they can be this kind of active non-participation is one strategy to kind of highlight the illegitimacy of a government that has been kind of violating democratic principles. Can be quite powerful, but sometimes it can also backfire. So I don't know exactly what the situation is there, because sometimes also parliamentary participation can be a way of stopping constitutional amendments, for example, that enhance the power of a government and so on. So it depends on the institutional structure that the country has and the kind of mechanisms that parliaments can play and the size of the representation that they have and hold in parliament. So I don't have sufficient information to say, but I just want to kind of raise that sometimes boycotts can be more powerful, whereas often they're kind of written off as unstrategic. Yeah.
Thank you. We have time for perhaps 2 more questions. We won't have time for all of them. I saw the lady in the middle. And if you could please keep your question brief, we'll have time for 1 or 2 more.
Thank you. It's actually not a question, so it will be brief. It's a piece of information. I'm Lena Johansson de Chateau, and I'm Chief Evaluator at SIDA. And just in addition to what has been said already, the development offers, of course, are very important for bringing in research into SIDA's operations. We are aware that we are less good at including research evidence, especially in the sort of appraisal of individual contributions. That's my understanding, that that's where the most room of improvement is. Just to assure you that there's an intense work, thank you all four of you, by the way, going on at SIDA on how we can improve ourselves in using evidence in strategy implementation and appraisal of contributions. As part of that, making research publications accessible to staff members. Also, in November, we will convene a meeting with representatives of all the main research institutions in Sweden, universities. And what can be of interest maybe for the whole audience is that we are soon publishing, or this fall, a large strategic evaluation of SIDA's work with conflict sensitivity. So that was my piece of information. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, which is much related to what we have been discussing here. One question from the whole group of you. I saw you first, actually, so we won't have time for all of you, but please.
Thank you. My name is Lani, and I'm working for ACT Church of Sweden. So I'm really excited to hear about your papers, and it was very comprehensive, all of them. And I mean, from our perspective in the organization, we are moving towards localization. And we are working with SIDA very closely. And from the Latin American region, we get 90% of SIDA funding for our projects. So I'm thinking about the political landscape in Latin America, particularly because there are many electoral processes coming in Colombia, in Honduras. We see that also democratization has been used in El Salvador to have an authoritarian regime. So for me, the question is, you have given many findings and recommendations at the institutional level, but what would be your recommendations for civil society in Sweden that is working with civil society in those contexts to help them? Because for me, the question is, in this changing landscape with very limited funding, what is our role? Should it be accompaniment? Should it be being with them? What would be your recommendations for our organizations here?
Thank you very much for that. And we have a lot of civil society organizations so I will direct that questions to our free researchers, and also that will be your final comments for today. We'll start with you, Gulla.
Thank you so much, Lani, for that question. Honestly, I don't know. I mean, I think this challenge of shrinking funding and so on, it creates problems for prioritization. And given the limited insight that I have into the work that civil society organizations in Sweden are currently doing, I don't know how to recommend what should be prioritized, but perhaps an evaluation should be done of where you see the greatest impacts or where you see the greatest risks, both now and moving forward, and to prioritize those areas.
I don't think I have like a full answer, but I could say maybe something about the Electoral Observer Mission in Colombia, which is actually a civil society organization that has been like actually funding mainly by Sweden for many years, and they have shown particularly very good in observing as a civil society. So they work as a network, and I think that one way is this, thinking about these other countries and how to actually strengthen the electoral observer missions from civil society organizations, because they tend to have a much more long access in areas that are very not very far from what the institutions sometimes can actually have access, and as a way maybe to try to protect from more violent elections. I think that the case of Colombia and I work directly with them, and I think that partly of the data collection, but all the work that they do is actively because they have this like very broad network with different local civil society organizations. So that might be a way of thinking on how to also work with local civil society organizations in other parts in Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate.
And I think this is a piece of the sort of peace and democratization landscape we haven't gotten to talk so much about today, but is really key in sort of taking the focus on issues forward into the longer term. So thinking not just about the issues that armed groups raise, but that reflects needs and concerns that exist in society. And so civil society actors thinking about how to take some of these issues that we know exist, but how to address them from other ways than perhaps an elite level negotiation. So how to sort of think about creative ways to address these issues, to make it so the sort of needs that underlie the issues can be addressed, but also thinking about ways to perhaps advocate for certain issues remaining on the agenda, that they are part of the negotiations. I think the Darfur peace agreement we highlight in the report is a good example of where issues sort of fell away from the negotiating table, but the community's response to this peace agreement was very clear that this does not address what really drives the conflict here. So bringing that back into the negotiating process.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you to all of our presenters, Gulla, Juan, Kate, Janina, who was with us online, and also thank you to both of our discussants, Christopher and Janni. A warm applause to all of you. I would also like to remind you that all of the reports we have discussed here today, together with a bunch of other very read-worthy reports, are online at EBA's website, and some of them are also available physically in the back of the room. Thank you to the audience for coming, for great questions, and for your participation. See you again.